we're going to pray, and then we'll get started this morning. God, thanks again for the chance to worship you. Thank you that we can come here together to collectively worship, but also, Father, to expose ourselves to your word, to be transformed, to take the things that we learn out, to be more like you. And so, Father, I pray you'll help us to do just that this week, and we'll thank you for it in Christ's name. Amen. I'm going to start things a little bit differently this morning. I want you to close your eyes just for a moment. And as you have closed your eyes, I want you to think about the time in your life the worst time in your life when you were not good enough. The time in your life, the worst, keep your eyes closed, the time in your life when somebody told you you're not good enough, when you didn't get the job, when maybe somebody in a relationship walked out on you. Time when you just simply weren't good enough. I'm not going to ask you to relive the whole thing, but just feel that pain just enough. Because we've all been there at that moment when someone, something, some event made us feel that we just simply weren't good enough. All right, you can look back up here now. You think about that for a moment. And if you really delved into it, it could have happened, something happened to you when you were a child, and you felt the pain all over again. You felt what it was like for someone to tell you you're not good enough. For someone to tell you that you're never going to make it, that you will never be good enough to be on their team or to be a part of their life or to be a part of their organization or to be anything like that. It may have been a time because of that then that you felt rejected and alone and lonely and all of the things that come with it. A lot of times, and most times, most of us have at some point in our lives been made to feel that we simply aren't good enough. It could have been, as I said, a relationship. Nowadays, it could be somebody online. I mean, you say the wrong thing online, the next thing you know, everybody piles on, and you're a quasi-celebrity. I mean, it can be anything today. We've had family members that have made us not feel good enough. We've had organizations that have not made us feel good enough. Religion, church has often made people not feel good enough. There used to be this thing in church where it was like we created a whole generation of spiritual neurotics where people would leave the door at the end and they go, "Well, Pastor, you really stepped on my toes today." It's like they had to feel bad in order to feel good. You know, it's like we would even sing the hymns, where we go, "And such a worm as I," it was like, I'm a worm and all those kinds of things. And I get the tension that goes with that. Because the fact of the matter is, in some respects, we're simply not good enough. But people leave us there. And so when we talk about this issue of imperfection that we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks, we have to confront this issue of what do we do when we don't just feel good enough, but when we're not good enough. There were so many different things that I could have started with this morning, even in my own life, that I could identify with. And as I even talk about them and feel them myself, it's like you can feel it in your gut. It may even trigger some emotions that are like, either, I need to get back at that person, or, man, I'll show them, or that kind of a thing. Or you always see when, if the organization or something happens and it fails because they didn't pick you, you're like, they should have picked me, But then when they succeed, you were like, oh, We don't feel good enough. Often it's been a person, it could have been events, could have been a situation, could have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. What do we do when we're not good enough? Because I got news for you. In this day and age that we are today, especially this Western culture, we always have this pressure to be more, to do more, and to have more. Think about that. We are under this incredible pressure especially to look a certain way, that if your abs look this way on the magazine, then you're acceptable, but if they don't, then you're not. If you look this certain way as a female or male, then you're acceptable and everybody's going to clap, but if not, you simply don't measure up. You're not good enough. If you have a certain income or you have a certain job or you don't have another type of job, then because you're doing that, well, maybe, or because you live over here but you don't live there, then guess what? You aren't quite good enough. And so it's who we are and what we have. And there's this pressure to be, do, and have more. And here's what's interesting. When somebody finally goes and they get the body they think they want, or they get the money that they think they want, and they said, oh, I got this amount of money, I'm living in this particular house, I'm driving this type of car, now I'm good enough. And guess what happens when they get there? And when they get that car, and they get that body, or they get that whatever it is that they're looking for, suddenly guess what happens? They don't feel good enough. Because there's somebody else that has more, that does more. And it becomes this vicious cycle of performance. It's imperfection. But what do we do about it? There's an interesting passage here in Colossians chapter 1, and those of you that have been around and have heard us talk about Colossians, Paul is writing it from prison, but he gets kind of lofty. If you happen to have read ahead at all in the passage, it's like there's this like incredible high theological language that Paul seems to use to talk about Jesus here. But it's very interesting what he says. And we're going to look at the text, and we're going to come back around and talk about what do we do when we're not good enough, because there's some things that's pointed out here that's very interesting. He starts out in verse 15, and he starts talking about Jesus. And he says, the Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. That's great. That sounds good, doesn't it? He starts out talking about Jesus. Now, there's a reason for this, because there were so many different philosophies that were at work during the formation of the early church. There was ascetic philosophies. There was Gnosticism. There were all these different philosophies of the way people lived life. There were folks who had different views of who God was and who Jesus was. There were people that, and it's different. Like some of our founding fathers were what they call deists. And whether you know what a deist is, you've got an atheist who doesn't believe that there's a God. There's an agnostic that's not sure whether there's a God. I always say an agnostic is an atheist without a sense of conviction. They got their feet planted on both sides. Well, I'm not sure, so I'm going to keep my feet on both sides of the fence. But a deist is somebody that literally believes that God created the universe and said, "Here you go," and went, "See ya," and walked away. Like doesn't have anything to do with it. He created it, but now he's at a distance and he can't be known. And so Paul was addressing a lot of these things about who Jesus is, and he's like, listen, y'all that think that Jesus is not that big of a deal, he starts out and says, listen, this guy Jesus, guess what? He's part of the Godhead, and he was there at the creation of this whole thing. He was there. This is an issue even today when you talk to people. There are a lot of people that will still say, oh, I believe in God. Or even better, you get this. Well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. Anybody ever heard that one? I'm spiritual. Ask them what that actually means. I don't know what that means. What it does is it sounds spiritual, doesn't it? You're like, it's meant for you not to question. Oh, you're spiritual. And then you think to yourself, gee, I'm not, so now I'm not good enough. They're better than I am. I'm spiritual. Because people don't really want to talk about this thing of Jesus and who he is. A lot of it is because people have used Jesus in the wrong way. They've used him as a battering ram. I would love right now, I would love to make a meme about Jesus was not a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent. Because when you go on Twitter, he's being used on both sides. Well, Jesus, suddenly the self-righteous side of the Republican Party, they're all one, hey, Jesus, da 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 da. Now all of a sudden, you got the Democrat, the liberal side for years that didn't want anybody to even talk about God, and we had separation of church and state, and you had Falwell and all this going on. Now everybody's claiming Jesus on both sides. And it's so funny because I watched both of them totally misinterpreting everything he said. It's like Jesus has become a battering ram. He used to be a battering ram just for us Baptists, but now he's a battering ram for everybody, And it seems like very few people understand it. And it's funny because they didn't understand him then. And so Paul's trying to correct this. He goes, look, this guy Jesus was God. He was there and he says, look, he's the image of God. He's the firstborn in all creation, everything in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. And then he says this, thrones, now listen to this, thrones, powers, or rulers and authorities, they've all been created through him and for him. So what he says is that you think you've got leaders that are in charge. They're not. He's the ultimate leader. He created this thing and he's got control of it, even though you don't think he does. By the way, just so you know, I want to say this since I got on the political thing a little bit. No president, no leader in Congress, Republican, Democrat, or independent, is more God ordained than any other. Let me say that again. There's only one Messiah. We haven't had one in years. He was crucified and rose from the dead. And if one of our political leaders can do that, then I will trust them that much. But until that point, they are, like the rest of us, imperfect. This is why Paul says to the church of Colossae, Jesus is the one that has created this whole thing. He's the only one that can claim to be a ruler, an authority. So then he goes on, and I went down. It's like my iPad went. So then he says, he is before all things. Now listen to this, verse 17. So he's created it. He says he is before all things, and then he shatters the deistic view. And in him, everything is held together. You know, there's certain things that when you're cooking, I can't believe I'm using a cooking illustration this morning because most of you know I cook eggs. But there's certain things that when you're cooking, certain items that are meant to hold everything else together, you know. And years ago, when my kids were a little smaller, my wife, when she was traveling, would make food. We put it in she put it in the freezer. And I remember she made a meatloaf, and it was allegedly cooked. And so what does she do to make it easy for Bob, like Garanimals, but in the freezer? It was do this, you know, it's like step 1, take out of the freezer. Step 2, preheat the oven. Step 3. So I followed all of the steps. And so Lauren and Josh came in and said that. He go, hey, Mommy, we got meatloaf today. Because usually what it was is we're having eggs or grandma's chicken and rice bake from Publix, you know, and here's your carrots kind of thing. So we get the meatloaf and I pull it out and I have no idea what I did, but the meatloaf was apart and it was watery. It's like the consistency was gone. My daughter said, Dad, what did you do? I said, that's always a question. When the food goes back, Dad, what did you do? I still have no idea because my wife said, all you had to do was follow the directions. The meatloaf just fell apart. It wasn't even edible. And this is the thing that he's saying here. Listen, Jesus is the consistency that holds this whole thing together. It's not like he's created this thing and he lets it go, because sometimes, I don't know about you, I don't open the newspaper, but I turn on the headlines and I'll turn on Alexa and say, play my flash briefing, and Alexa will tell me all the bad stuff that's going on in the world and who did what to whom and this and that, and I'll read smart news on the iPad and go through all this, and I'm thinking, the world is gone nuts. But the thing is that's why he still has us here. Because we're supposed to have good news. We're not supposed to get caught up in all the bad news. We're supposed to have the good news. And he says, listen, he's going to ultimately hold all this thing together. And then he says this, verse 18. Notice what he steps from. He steps from the creation of the world to the sustaining of everything. And then he says, and he, Jesus, is the head of the what? The body, the church. He's the one that calls the shots in the church. The church universal. And he says he's the beginning of the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything, watch this, he might have the supremacy. Ooh. See, the point that Paul is making all of a sudden here is that he is the only one that's good enough to rule. He's the only one, because he created this, is good enough to hold it together. He's the only one that's good enough to deserve the supremacy above everybody else. Not political leaders, not spiritual leaders, not anybody like that. Have you all seen the guy floating around, Kenneth Copeland, that wanted the jet, and he was the most recent guy that wanted television wanted a jet. Now they're making memes out of the guy, and he was yelling, had his finger in the face of the reporter, and he said that he needs a private airplane because the airplane is like what did he call it? A flying tube with demons in it. So he needs money to buy an airplane. And the thing is here's what's going to happen. People are going to send him money so that he can buy his airplane. And I'm thinking to myself, anything that we do that doesn't focus on the supremacy of who Jesus is, of pointing people to him, including untruths, to use him as a battering ram to get my point across to somebody else, to manipulate them, to change them to my way of thinking, is wrong. So he says that we want him to have the supremacy in everything. Now watch this. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him, watch this, I love this word, to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Now, there's something interesting here. If you have to make peace, what does that mean was going on prior to making peace? There was war, there was conflict that was going on. And so Paul is laying out where all the imperfection that we talked about comes from, that there is going to be conflict between God and man. That there's going to be this eternal battle that is ensuing. The battle that started from before time when Satan was Lucifer and was an angel and fell from heaven because of the fact that he wanted to be like God. And that ever since then, all the way starting with Adam and Eve, people have wanted to be like God. They've wanted to have this sort of special knowledge so that they can give it to somebody else. Why do you think people go to palm readers? Why do you think they go to spiritualists? Why do you think they go to somebody else who is in authority over them, that knows how to maybe manipulate and twist things and wants to be able to give them? It's a conflict thing that occurs. And there's a conflict between God and man. And he says, listen, in the middle of this, you're right, because the conflict is that people have sinned, and here's the news. And it's not good. The news is we really aren't good enough. So, I don't think you have to do this whole thing like, we used to beat people over this, especially in the olden days, was, for such a worm as I. Then we go talk about it at the cross, and that's okay. And I guess if you want to call yourself a worm, it's fine, because there's this tension that occurs. Because God created us. I've never invented anything. I have all these things that I think are great inventions, and then I wind up somebody else invented them. You ever done that? You go, then somebody else has done it. But you think about people that invented things like, let's do something more modern. You think about Steve Jobs that invented this. This can be used for good or bad. Television can be used for good or bad. Today, right now, I love this, because my daughter I don't forget what country she's in right now, but she doesn't have to stop at a payphone and call me, and I'm not wondering what she's doing. She can go on WhatsApp and tell me, hey, I just landed in so-and-so. I'm like, yeah. See, when people invent something and they create something, they do it because they want to solve a problem. They want to fix something. We want to make life easier. They're creating it and they're inventing it. And he says, listen, God, let me just say this, God created you and created me individually because there is a problem that only you can help solve for somebody else. There is a person that only you can reach. There is a unique gift and talent ability that you have that I don't have, that God has given you the ability to reach out and help somebody else. The ability to transform. He wants to use you. So I can tell you that I can feel like a worm and go, yeah, I'm not good enough, but God created me, so high value, but I'm not going to be good enough because of sin. And so Jesus says, guess what? I'm going to come in and I'm going to reconcile you back to him because you were created for something great, but we lost it over here because of sin. But now I've come in and I've made peace and brought you back around, so you're back to this again. For him creating you with meaning and purpose and direction. And then he says this, he goes on, said he made peace through his blood. He said, once you were alienated from God and were enemies in your minds because of evil behavior, but now he has reconciled you, verse 22, by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight. Look at this. Listen to this. Holy in his sight, without blemish, and free from accusation. If you've never been accused of something vile, I mean literally something vile, that you didn't do, then you can't identify with it. But have you ever had an accusation hurled at you that was not even true? But you know, today people can type an accusation in, and the next thing everybody runs with it. You know, it's that Winston Churchill used to talk about that a lie gets halfway around the world before truth has an opportunity to get its pants on. You know, and that was back in Churchill's day. You could be accused of something and then pulling it back, it's too late. He says, listen, because of what Jesus did, you're going to be presented to him without blemish, free from accusation. He says, if you continue in your faith, and the idea is that you will continue in your faith if you know him, established and firm, and you not move from the hope that is held out in the government, from the hope that's held out in your political positions. No, from your hope that's held out in the gospel. And he says, listen, this is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, have become a servant. Wow, man, that is some good stuff when you start that out, because you look at the tension that occurs, and he says, listen, you're not going to be good enough. You were created perfectly, but Adam and Eve and sin messed this thing up, and you can talk about original sin, whatever the theological term is you want to use, but he says the whole reason why Jesus came is to reconcile you and pull you back to this. So what happens when you're not good enough? What happens when you don't feel good enough? What happens when you've been told that you're not good enough? What Paul says to us is, remember that when you are not good enough, that Jesus is more than enough. That's his whole point. You don't have to be good enough. You can't be good enough. You can't measure up. Because God doesn't change the standards, but everybody else does. You ever notice that? It's like you get to the point and they go, oh, no, let's move a little bit further, move a little bit further, move a little bit further. And so his message to us is, listen, when you are not good enough, remember that Jesus is more than enough. Why? We saw it earlier, because he creates, and if he creates, that means that he's got a purpose for me, which we talked about. So he creates, he's carrying us along. That idea of sustaining, of holding it all together. See, sometimes I think that for some reason, when we're going through conflict and we've got tough stuff going on, that somehow we think that Jesus has abandoned us. Like, oh, well, you know, I got bad stuff going on, so God's not there. He must not love me because I've got bad stuff going on. No, we live in a crazy world, and we're going to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And you know as well as I do, you're going to fall. Your child's going to fall. Unless your child had a disability or something, when your child starts to walk, what happens? Kid falls, you pick him up, and you brush him off. Sometimes I remember my son over here, he whacked his head. Just bam, right into had a nice goose egg. Of course, then everybody's like, "What'd you do to him?" They fall, they get hurt, they trip, stuff happens. But it doesn't mean that I don't love them. We pick them up and we try to help them again. And it's like I heard somebody say with your kids, the older that they get, that it's like flying a kite. You're rolling the string out, you're rolling the string out, you're rolling the string out until they get like right here, and you're holding it by a thread, by two fingers before you let the kite go. Well, nowadays they reel it back in and come back home. I'm just kidding. They don't really do that, but it's hard. It's hard to let go of that final little bit so that they'll soar. But here's the thing with Jesus. We see throughout all the stories of the Scriptures, even sustaining the people of Israel when they were disobedient. We even see my favorite story with Peter in the storm. The storm did not cease. Peter came out on the water in the turbulence, and Jesus took him and walked with him back to the boat and didn't cease the storm until he got back into the boat. Sometimes he's going to walk with us right through the storm, and he goes, "Just watch me. Don't look at anything. Just watch me." Did you see the walk across what are their names? Just Walendas. Did you see the Walendas walk across in New York a couple of weeks ago again? I'm thinking to myself, first of all, I don't like heights, but if you watch, I don't know how they're able to talk and do it. But if you look at what they're not looking around like this. They're watching. It's like step by step, and I'm kind of like, I remember watching him go across the Grand Canyon. But sometimes when we're in the storm and we're on that tightrope and we're having trouble keeping our balance, we have got to keep our eyes on him. And that's all he's doing, is he's saying, look at me, I got this. I got it. I'm gonna carry you through, but I've got this. I know you don't feel good enough. I know you feel like you're never going to have enough. I know you feel like that you're a failure, and that religious people have made you feel like that. But listen, watch me. I got you. I've got you. I got you. I'm going to take care of you. I got you. Because when you don't feel good enough, I'm more than enough. And then, of course, the whole thing in the end when he says, listen, he's reconciled it. You know what Jesus ultimately has done, that he's basically asked us to do, is he's connected us back to God. That's what the reconciliation is. By him paying for our sins on the cross, we are now reconnected. And it's not like an internet connection that comes and goes. We're connected permanently. That's why he says you're going to be presented to him without spot, without blemish, without accusation, because I have made peace. He now looks at you and sees me. You're connected. So you don't have to be good enough because of what he's done. I think about that, and I think that's ultimately what God has asked us to do as a church. When we got our new logo a few years back, people were like, what? A couple of people were like, what is that? Why are there circles? How come we don't have a cross? Because we have a cross in here. The circles are connected. And see, that's how community. You got the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. You've got the connection that occurs. We are supposed to be helping to bring people to Jesus. We're supposed to be connecting to our community, connecting to one another, connecting to him. That's what it's all about. It's all about the connection that he provides, because people aren't going to be good enough to have their own connection. They need him. We're not trying to drive them to a church. We're not trying to get them to come in and be a part of just something that we're doing. We're trying to get them connected, because that's what he's done for us. Because really, when it's all said and done, we're never going to feel good enough. But what does he say to us? He loves us. He values us. He cares for us. So that when we don't feel good enough, when we're not good enough, we have to remember that he is more than enough. Let's pray.